In the context of understanding the biogeographic patterns of living organisms on Earth, it's also important for us to understand a little bit of the history of the Earth itself. Geological timescales have been divided into eons, eras, epochs and periods based on stratigraphic layers with unique assemblages of fossils. Now, these are based largely on these index or guide fossils such as calcareous foraminiferans, silicaceous radiolarians of the Cenozoic, chitinous graptolites of the Silurian, the ammonite cephalopods of the Mesozoic, and so on. And this is all sort of set in this larger context of the age of the Earth itself, which is estimated at 4.6 billion years. In the context of biogeography, a lot of the patterns that we see are influenced by or driven by the configuration and the location of different continents, which has changed over this time. And the explanation for that comes from Alfred Wegener. Now, Wegener synthesized evidence from geology, geophysics, paleontology, paleoclimate, and biogeography, and presented his theory of continental drift in 1912, but it was only accepted in the 1960s. Now, in his theory, he said that the continental rocks floated on a layer that were less dense, floated on a layer of viscous fluid mantle, and he hypothesized that the major land masses were once united as a continent called Pangaea. And more specifically, the kind of evidence that he got was from topographic features, including mountains, island chains, oceanic ridges, all that were found to be aligned with the proportions of Gondwana land, paleoclimate evidence from glacial deposits, paleo evidence from the distributions of many taxa, such as Glossopteris, beetles, fish, and frogs, and eventually paleomagnetism and the emergence of a mechanism in the 60s finally convinced geologists about continental drift. Here you can see the distribution of caribid beetles in Australia and South America, of Proteaceae across South America, Africa and Southeast Asia, piped frogs here across South America and Africa, as well, of course, as the shape of continents, ice movement, and all of this eventually provided evidence and substance for the theory of continental drift. Wegener himself proposed that Pangaea had began as a rift and expanded into an ocean, that continental blocks had largely retained their initial outlines, that the rates of movement were really slow, and he proposed that radioactive heating might be a cause of block movement, and that these forces were gradual and not catastrophic. What we know today is that plate tectonics is that continental drift is caused by plate tectonics, which is a complex interaction of the Earth's crust, mantle, and core. The plates are roughly 100 kilometers thick. They're a thin rigid layer of crust, which adhere to the upper layer of mantle or lithosphere, and the asthenosphere is the deeper fluid layer of mantle. And the forces that result in the movement of these continents are a ridge push, or a force that's generated by molten rock rising from the Earth's core through the mantle at these mid-oceanic ridges, a mantle drag, or a tendency to ride of the crust to ride the mantle like suitcases or boxes on a conveyor belt, and a slab pull, which is the force generated as the subducting crust pulls the trailing crust after it along the surface. So these forces are believed to drive the movement of these plates, and therefore underlie what we call continental drift. Now, the Earth's tectonic history that we have knowledge of comprises the history of the continents of Pangaea, Gondwana land, and Laurasia, and as you go back in time, of course, there's less evidence, but we have knowledge of the formation and breakup of Pangaea, the breakup of Laurasia, and a significant event that's influenced many biogeographic patterns today, which is the breakup of Gondwana land. Pangaea itself is considered to be a temporary in geological time, structure that existed as a single unit only in the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic. The northern half, the Laurasia, has a complex early history and is differentiated from Gondwana land. Gondwana land includes present-day South America, Africa, Madagascar, Arabia, India, Australia, the islands around Australia, and Antarctica. And there was one giant ocean basin. Obviously, if the continents were together, the rest of the world was an ocean, and this ocean basin was called Panthalassa. Now, if we go back before Pangaea, life begins on Earth with anaerobic singular cell organisms over 3.5 billion years ago. Relatively little is known about the specific processes that led to this. There's speculation that primitive molecules were formed in areas of high energy, such as perhaps hydrothermal vents, where chemicals came together, eventually leading to the formation of proteins and the genetic material DNA and RNA, and eventually to the first single-cell organisms. Now, a critical moment in Earth's history is when cyanobacteria, the first aerobic organisms, appear about 3.2 to 3.5 billion years ago, because these start using photosynthesis to produce energy and therefore start producing oxygen, and eventually lead to the great oxygenation event a billion years or more later, which leads to the formation of the ozone layer and subsequent cooling of the Earth, which is one of the first major steps that leads to the possibility of life as we know it today. Over the next billion years, 1.8 to 800 million years ago, there's many ice ages during what's called the boring billion, but this sort of sets the stage, processes that occur here set the stage for the appearance of multicellular organisms about 800 million years ago. Pangaea breaks up in the early Jurassic. Most of the great evolutionary radiations that we know of today occur after the breakup of Pangaea. And it's believed that a diversification of many taxa were a direct consequence of this breakup. By the mid-Cretaceous, Laurasia had already divided into three parts, and by the late Cretaceous, North America and Asia were connected by Beringia. And as I mentioned, many contemporary biogeographic patterns are influenced by the breakup of Gondwana land. The continents in the southern hemisphere, as well as many of these that extend significantly into the northern hemisphere, are separated. Were once part of Gondwana land and separated. Now, we have here the stages through which this happened. In the early Jurassic, Africa and South America break away from the rest of Gondwana land. India and Madagascar are adjacent to the northeast margin of Africa. Australia is located along the southeastern margin of Africa. Madagascar and India then separate from Antarctica and Australia. In the mid-Cretaceous, Australia and New Zealand rift from Antarctica. India moves north, drifts north, is this little sailboat that's drifting through the Indian Ocean, collides with Eurasia at about 55 million years before present. This graphic shows you the movement of the continents over the last 130, 140 million years. One thing that's really interesting is that as India floats up towards Asia, the Tethys narrows, becomes more shallow, and these warm, shallow waters are believed to have been the breeding ground for a group of pig-like ungulates that went into the water and eventually became whales and dolphins. Now there were many climatic and biogeographic consequences. Both paleoclimate and paleocirculations change. So as the configurations of continents change, now the margins that are exposed that have seas and oceans they're going to be exposed to different winds, to different patterns of rainfall, and so large-scale climatic as well as small-scale climatic changes occur. Similarly, ocean circulation patterns change. This affects both marine organisms, but it also affects large-scale climatic patterns. The proportions of landmass changes dramatically. Precipitation patterns change. As I mentioned, paleocurrents, wind and temperature changes occur. The Tethyan Seaway gets closed, results in the formation of the Himalayas when India bumps up against Asia, and as I mentioned, may have led to the evolution of whales and dolphins. A more recent one is the formation of Isthmus of Panama, which we've mentioned, and results in separation of organisms on the Pacific and Atlantic sides of the isthmus. So very broadly speaking, sometime in the Precambrian, perhaps about 700 to 800 million years ago, the first multicellular organisms appear. There's the great diversification event in the Cambrian. The earliest fishes appear in the Ordovician. In the Silurian, in terms of land masses, Australia is quite close to the equator, unlike today. The Devonian is when the fishes really expand. It's known as the age of fishes, but it's also when first vertebrates invade land. In the Carboniferous, the first reptiles, and shortly afterwards in the Permian, the first mammal-like reptiles evolve. The earliest mammals evolved in the Triassic. The earliest birds in the Jurassic. At the end of the Cretaceous, we see the extinction of the dinosaurs, but it's also the period when flowering plants dominate on land. And then the Cenozoic is divided into today. It used to be called the Tertiary and Quaternary. It's now divided more equally as the Paleogene and Neogene. These again are periods where there's major extinctions of marine invertebrates and land mammals in the Paleocene, and then there's extinctions and mass biotic exchanges between the Nearctic and the Neotropics in the Paleogene, but also major changes to land masses during all of these periods. In the Paleogene, for example, is when India and Africa collide with Eurasia, and in the Neogene, the Central American archipelago forms, and the Pan-Isthmus closes about 3 to 4 million years ago. The Red Sea also forms during this period. So this is a really sort of like quick and coarse summary, but just to give you a really broad idea of the biological and tectonic changes over this period. Despite these sort of really major extinction events, these major diversification events, things like the appearance of mammals, the appearance of dinosaurs, the appearance of snakes or birds as this very specially evolved group that today have thousands of species in them. The patterns of biogeography that we see today are still strongly influenced by very recent events, namely the Pleistocene. And this has been characterized by what are called these glacial-interglacial cycles, much of which occurs in the late Neogene and the Pleistocene and Holocene in the last 2 million years. This is a period when the tectonic plates have been largely stable, but global and regional climates have experienced significant upheavals in the form of these periods of glaciation and the interglacial periods. Evidence for this has come from analysis of tree rings, packrat middens, pollen deposits, ice cores, lithological evidence, as well as coral reefs. Now, the biogeographic responses to these changes have been changes in where the habitats were, the extent of these habitats, and the configuration of these habitats. changes in the nature of environment and climatic conditions and cues, and the formation and dissolution of dispersal routes. So as when we talked about biogeographic processes, we talked very much about both how species, organisms have to disperse, and so these dispersal routes would have been critical, and once they reach locations, they have to be able to survive there, and climatic and environmental cues and conditions would have been crucial to this, as are the location and extent and configuration of the habitats. So what did species do? Some species floated with their optimal habitat, others remained and adapted, and others underwent a range or extinction. And these are really interesting to think about, because while we study these in biogeography and evolution as what happened over the period of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, this is what species now have to deal with in the context of climate change. And very simply, what can species do in response to climate change? They can move, they can adapt, or they can die. And this really captures what the effect that climate change has on species and what their options are. There were, over this period, of course, also evolutionary responses. There are what are called neotropical Pleistocene refugia, which were these lowland rainforests with insular patterns of species richness and endemism and seemingly heterogeneous habitats. They're not habitats that might have been conventionally considered to have high levels of insularity or endemism, but this came about because they were during these periods of glaciation, they became islands or refugia because they were surrounded by areas with glaciers, and those are the only places that these plants and animals could survive. There were also glacial refugia or nunataks that persisted within or adjacent to ice sheets and were found in areas of Beringia, coastal regions of the Pacific Northwest, and Nova Scotia. The southern Western Ghats that we've talked about a few times has been hypothesized to have been a refugium during the Pleistocene glaciations. The glacial cycles also had major effects on extinctions. Most plant extinctions occurred during the initial cycles, and a few during recent cycles. There was mass extinctions of marine invertebrates during the early glacial cycles. Many terrestrial vertebrate extinctions are believed to be more recent, as recently as 20,000 years, such as of herbivores such as mastodons, mammoths and ground sloths, predators such as hyenas, saber-toothed tigers and lions, and large birds such as teratons, all went extinct during this period. And there have been many hypotheses about the causes of extinction. The recentest extinctions have been hypothesized to be due to humans, that they were responsible for the extirpation of herbivores as well as carnivores and scavengers dependent on them. There are also, however, hypotheses that humans did hunt large animals as well as dangerous carnivores as game, as evolutionary signaling. And some of the evidence of this comes from our knowledge of human evolution. They entered America from Asia during the late Wisconsin period and moved southwards. And fossil evidence shows coexistence as well as hunting. The extinctions are non-random. They're more large mammals. And later immigrants from Beringia and Eurasia fared better. And you can sort of see the extinctions move southward, perhaps along with the movement of humans. So to sum this up, this is a sort of very quick ride through the history of the Earth. Just passing in passing mention the origin of life, and the early history of the continents of Pangaea, Laurasia, and Gondwana. This movement of continents has been the substrate upon which biogeographic and evolutionary processes happen, where continents are in relation to each other, results in dispersal routes of being available or not available, results in those land masses being large or small, results in the potential for speciation, and the drivers of extinction as well. When we're able to combine our knowledge of the Earth's history with evolutionary processes, as well as with the patterns of relatedness of phylogenetics, we can gain a true understanding of the biogeography of plants and animals on Earth, and their evolutionary history, which all combine to result in the contemporary patterns of diversity and distribution that are of course also influenced by contemporary ecology, as also in the last few hundreds or thousands of years, human influence. So thank you. That brings us to the end of these modules on macroecology and biogeography. Thank you.